Today, we have an emotional story about finding family in the most unexpected places. Jack, a police officer with a painful past, meets Claire, a young girl who has been facing the world alone. Together, they embark on a journey filled with challenges, healing, and the true meaning of love and family. If this story touches your heart, please like the video, leave your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Jack sat in his patrol car, the radio crackling faintly in the background as the stillness of the night wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. He had taken the night shift willingly, preferring the silence and solitude that it offered. The small town of Maplewood was quiet, its streets empty save for the occasional stray cat or the rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. Jack found comfort in the emptiness of the dark hours. It gave him space to think, to breathe, to forget for a little while. Jack was not like most officers in Maplewood. His colleagues preferred the day's shifts, bustling with activity and the chatter of townspeople. But for Jack, the day brought back memories he wasn't ready to face. The brightness of the sun only served to highlight the empty spaces in his life, spaces left by the family he had lost. The night shift had become his refuge, a sanctuary where he could hide from the world and the painful reminders of what he no longer had. His blue eyes, once full of warmth, were now tinged with a sadness that never seemed to lift. It was during one of these late-night patrols that Jack first noticed her, a young girl, no older than 9 or 10, standing in the dim light of the laundromat. Her small figure was framed by the glow of the fluorescent lights, her shadow stretching long across the pavement. She was alone, her head bowed as she methodically loaded clothes into one of the machines. Jack slowed his patrol car, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. There was something about the sight that didn't sit right with him. Claire, that was the name he would later learn, was a tiny figure against the backdrop of the laundromat's humming machines. Her clothes were simple, a faded jacket that seemed a size too big, and sneakers that were scuffed at the toes. Jack watched as she struggled slightly with a bag of laundry, her small hands working diligently to arrange everything just right. The laundromat was mostly empty at this hour, save for an older man dozing in the corner, completely unaware of the little girl nearby. Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. What was a child doing out at this hour, alone and unsupervised? He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her as she moved from one task to another, her focus unwavering. There was a tiredness about her, a sense of routine, as if she had done this many times before. Jack's instincts as a police officer told him that something was off, that this wasn't just a simple case of a child helping with chores. He didn't approach her that first night. Instead, he drove on, finishing his patrol, but the image of the little girl stayed with him. It gnawed at the edges of his mind, a quiet worry that he couldn't shake. Jack knew he needed to keep an eye on her, to understand what was really going on. Something told him that Claire's story was more complicated than it seemed, and he couldn't just turn away. The next few nights played out much the same way. As Jack made his rounds, he couldn't help but find himself glancing towards the laundromat, half expecting to see the small silhouette of Claire. And every time, there she was, alone, methodically going through the same routine of loading and unloading laundry. Jack's concern grew with each passing night. It wasn't just the late hour or the fact that she was alone. It was the consistency, the predictability of it all. Something about it felt wrong, like a secret hiding in plain sight. Jack began to notice the little details. The way Claire always glanced over her shoulder before entering the laundromat. The way she would sometimes freeze at the sound of a distant noise, her eyes wide and cautious. It was clear that this wasn't just a child helping her family with a late-night chore. There was fear in her movements, a hesitancy that spoke volumes to Jack. He had seen that kind of behavior before, in people who were trying to survive, people who had something to hide or something to fear. One particular night, Jack parked his patrol car across the street from the laundromat, the headlights off, watching as Claire went through her usual routine. She moved with a practiced efficiency, her small hands deftly handling the coins, the detergent, the clothes. Jack's heart ached as he watched her struggle to lift a particularly heavy bag, her face scrunching in determination. It wasn't right. No child should have to do this alone, night after night. He knew then that he had to do something. He couldn't just keep watching from a distance, hoping that things would somehow resolve themselves. The next day, Jack found himself at his desk, staring at the computer screen in front of him. He typed in a few queries, searching for any reports of missing children or families in need. Nothing came up that matched Claire's description. It was as if she didn't exist, as if she had slipped through the cracks of the system entirely. Jack felt a pang of frustration. He knew that if he wanted answers, he would have to get them himself. That night, Jack made a decision. He was going to approach Claire, to talk to her, and find out what was really going on. He didn't have a plan. He wasn't sure what he would say or how she would react, but he knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. He owed it to her and to himself to try and help. As he sat in his patrol car, watching the laundromat from a distance, Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The thought of confronting her made his stomach twist with unease, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Jack watched as Claire entered the laundromat once again, her small figure disappearing into the fluorescent lit space. He turned off the ignition and stepped out of his car, his heart pounding. It was time to find out the truth. Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he approached the laundromat. The door creaked open, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a sterile glow on the rows of machines. Claire was there, just as he expected. She stood on her tiptoes, trying to reach the detergent compartment of the washing machine. Jack cleared his throat gently, not wanting to startle her. "Hey there," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. Claire flinched slightly, her eyes darting towards him before quickly looking away. Her hands paused midair, the detergent bottle trembling just a bit. Jack took a small step forward, careful not to invade her space. "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just wanted to see if you're okay." Claire didn't answer at first. She resumed her task, pouring the detergent with deliberate slowness, her eyes fixed firmly on the washing machine in front of her. Jack could see the tension in her small frame, the way her shoulders hunched defensively. She was wary, and Jack couldn't blame her. He was a stranger and a police officer at that. It made sense that she would be guarded. Jack decided to try again, this time offering a small smile. "I see you here a lot. It's late for a kid to be out alone," he said, his tone gentle. "Do you have someone waiting for you? A parent, maybe?" Claire's gaze flickered towards him, her brow furrowing slightly. For a brief moment, Jack thought she might answer, but then she shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight line. She turned her attention back to the washing machine, her fingers brushing against the buttons as she started the cycle. Jack watched her, his concern growing. She was so small, so alone, and there was a sadness in her eyes that tugged at something deep inside him. "My name's Jack," he said, trying a different approach. "I'm a police officer, but I'm not here to get you in trouble, I promise. I just want to help." He took another step closer, his hands held out in front of him to show he meant no harm. Claire finally looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was a flicker of something there, fear, uncertainty, maybe even a glimmer of hope, but it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. "I don't need help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time Jack had heard her speak, and the quiet defiance in her tone only made him more determined. He could tell she was used to handling things on her own, that whatever her situation was, she'd learned not to rely on anyone else. But Jack also knew that no child should have to bear that kind of burden alone. Jack nodded slowly, not wanting to push her too hard. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "But if you ever do need anything at all, you can find me. I'm usually around here at night. You don't have to go through this alone." Claire didn't respond. She turned away from him, busying herself with the laundry as if to signal that the conversation was over. Jack hesitated for a moment longer, then sighed softly. He knew when to back off. Pushing her too much now would only make her retreat further. He had to earn her trust, and that would take time. He left the laundromat that night with more questions than answers. Who was Claire really? Why was she always alone at this hour, with no sign of any family or guardian? Jack's instincts told him that there was more to her story, something hidden beneath the surface that he couldn't yet see. He wasn't going to give up, though. He couldn't just walk away, not when every fiber of his being told him that this child needed help. Over the next few nights, Jack continued his patrols, keeping a watchful eye on the laundromat. He would see Claire there, always alone, her routine never changing. She was like a ghost, appearing at the same time, going through the same motions, then disappearing back into the shadows of the night. Jack's heart ached for her. He could see the weight she carried, the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin. He knew he had to be patient. Trust wasn't something that could be forced, especially not with someone as guarded as Claire. So, Jack waited, watching over her from a distance, ready to step in when the time was right. He made sure to be there every night. His patrol car parked discreetly across the street. The glow of the laundromat's lights a constant reminder of the fragile child within. Jack hoped that, eventually, Claire would see that he wasn't a threat, that he genuinely wanted to help her. Until then, he would be there, a silent guardian in the night, determined to protect her from whatever it was that had driven her to this lonely place. Whatever her story was, Jack was going to find out, and he was going to make sure she was safe. The laundromat was quieter than usual that night. Jack had made his rounds, the routine movements almost automatic by now, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself heading toward the laundromat earlier than usual, hoping that tonight, maybe Claire would open up a little more. He parked his patrol car across the street and watched as Claire appeared like clockwork, carrying her small bag of laundry. She looked even smaller in the dim light, her oversized jacket hanging off her frame. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He knew it was a delicate situation. Claire was guarded, her defenses high. But he also knew that if he didn't try to reach her, no one else would. As she stepped inside, Jack followed, the soft chime of the doorbell marking his entry. Claire turned, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him, but she didn't run. That was a small victory in itself. "Hey, Claire," Jack greeted her softly, keeping his distance. She gave him a wary look but didn't respond. He watched as she went about her routine, loading the washer, pouring the detergent. Jack knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to scare her off. He waited until she was done, then spoke again. "You know, I've been worried about you," Jack said, his voice gentle. "I see you here every night, and I can't help but wonder if you're okay." Claire paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure out his intentions. Jack continued, "I don't mean to pry, but if there's anything you need, I want to help." For a moment, there was silence. Claire's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes, the hesitation. He waited, giving her the space she needed. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear her. "My mom," she began, her words trailing off. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. "She passed away." Jack felt his heart clench at the admission. He hadn't expected her to open up, not like this, not so soon. He stayed quiet, letting her set the pace. "She got sick," Claire continued, her voice trembling slightly. "There was no one else, no family. It was just us." She looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "I don't want to go into foster care," she said, her voice firmer now, as if daring him to argue. "I can take care of myself. I don't need anyone's help." Jack nodded slowly, his chest aching with sympathy. He understood that kind of pain, the loss that hollowed you out, leaving you to navigate the world alone. He had lost his wife and daughter years ago in a car accident, a tragedy that had left him feeling like a shell of the man he once was. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to feel as though the world had moved on without you. I get it, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Losing someone like that, it's hard. And you're brave, Claire, for trying to make it on your own. But you shouldn't have to. He took a step closer, his eyes meeting hers. You deserve to have someone looking out for you. It doesn't mean you're not strong. It just means it's okay to let someone help. Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Jack could see the doubt, the fear, but also a flicker of something else. Hope. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor again. I just don't want to be a burden, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. You're not a burden, Claire. Not to me. Not to anyone who cares about you. He hesitated, then added, I lost my family too a long time ago. And I know how hard it is to let people in after that. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, Claire didn't say anything. The laundromat was filled with the hum of the machines, the rhythmic sound almost soothing in the silence between them. Finally, she nodded, just a small movement, but it was enough. Jack knew that trust wouldn't come overnight, but this was a start. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Jack gave her a gentle smile, his heart swelling with a mix of sadness and hope. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for now, this was enough. He would be there for her every step of the way until she no longer felt like she had to face the world alone. As Jack left the laundromat that night, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Claire needed someone, and maybe, just maybe, he needed her too. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Claire needed him more than she let on. The days following their conversation at the laundromat were filled with sleepless nights and a growing sense of determination. He found himself thinking about Claire constantly, how brave she was, how much she had endured on her own, and how wrong it was for a child her age to face the world without anyone to lean on. Jack knew that he had to do something. It wasn't just sympathy that drove him. It was love, a deep, genuine connection that he hadn't felt in a long time. One night, as Jack sat in his patrol car, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He decided that he was going to help Claire in the only way that truly mattered. He was going to become her guardian. He would foster her, and if things worked out, he would adopt her. Jack knew it wouldn't be easy. The system was complicated, full of red tape and endless paperwork, but he was willing to fight through all of it for Claire. She deserved a stable home, and Jack wanted to be the one to give it to her. The next morning, Jack made a call to Child Protective Services. His voice was steady, but inside, he felt a mix of emotions, nervousness, hope, fear. He explained Claire's situation as best as he could without betraying her trust, making it clear that she needed someone to look after her. The social worker on the other end listened patiently, then began explaining the process. Jack jotted down notes, his hand trembling slightly as he realized the magnitude of what he was about to do. After hanging up, Jack took a deep breath. This was just a beginning, but he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. He thought back to his own family, the life he had before the accident that had taken everything from him. For a long time, he had been lost, drifting through his days without any real direction. But now, with Claire, he felt like he had a reason to keep going. He was going to give her the life she deserved, and maybe, in the process, he could find a way to heal his own heart. The next time Jack saw Claire at the laundromat, he approached her with a new determination. She was sitting on the bench, her small frame hunched over as she waited for the laundry to finish. Jack sat down beside her, careful to leave enough space so she wouldn't feel crowded. Claire, he began, his voice soft but firm. She looked up at him, her eyes wary but curious. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, and I want to help you, really help you. Claire frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I want you to come live with me, he said. Not just for a little while, but for good. I want to be your guardian, Claire. I want to make sure you're safe, that you have a home, and that you don't have to do this alone anymore." For a moment, there was only silence. Claire stared at him, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open in shock. Jack could see the emotions playing across her face: fear, hope, disbelief. She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Why would you want to do that? I'm not your responsibility." Jack's heart ached at her words. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not a responsibility, Claire. You're a person, a brave, strong, incredible person who deserves to be loved and cared for. I lost my family a long time ago, and for a long time, I didn't think I could ever care about anyone again. But then I met you, and I realized that maybe we could help each other." Tears welled in Claire's eyes, and she quickly looked away, brushing them aside with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. What if it doesn't work out?" Jack nodded, understanding her fear. "I know it's scary," he said, "and I can't promise that everything will be perfect. But I can promise that I'll try my best every single day to make sure you're happy and safe. You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it, okay?" Over the next few weeks, Jack worked tirelessly to get everything in order. He met with social workers, filled out countless forms, and even had his home inspected to make sure it was suitable for fostering. It was a long, exhausting process, but Jack didn't mind. Every step brought him closer to giving Claire the home she deserved. He made sure to visit Claire regularly, bringing her small gifts: a new jacket to replace the worn one she always wore, a book he thought she might like, or simply her favorite snack. Slowly, he began to see a change in her. The guarded look in her eyes softened, and she began to smile more, a genuine smile that lit up her face. One day, Jack received the news he had been waiting for. He was approved to be Claire's foster parent. He felt a surge of relief and joy, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He couldn't wait to tell Claire. That evening, he went to the laundromat, his heart pounding with anticipation. Claire was there as always, and when she saw Jack approaching, she stood up, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Claire," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly, "I have some news. They approved me. You can come live with me, if you want." Claire stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and Jack felt his heart stop, worried that she might say no. But then, slowly, she nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Okay," she whispered. "I'd like that." Jack felt a wave of emotion wash over him, and he pulled her into a gentle hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Claire hugged him back, her small arms wrapping around him tightly. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "for not giving up on me." The transition wasn't without its challenges. Claire had been on her own for so long that learning to trust someone else, to rely on Jack, was difficult. There were moments of doubt, moments when she pulled away, afraid of getting too close. But Jack was patient. He gave her the space she needed, always reminding her that he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere. Slowly, they began to build a life together. They developed routines, making breakfast together in the mornings, watching movies on the weekends, taking walks in the park. Jack even taught Claire how to ride a bike, her laughter echoing through the quiet streets as she wobbled down the sidewalk. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, creating memories that would last a lifetime. One night, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle above, Claire turned to Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. Do you think one day you could adopt me? For real?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack felt his heart swell and he nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'd love that more than anything," he said, his voice breaking. "You're already my family, Claire, and I promise I'll always be here for you." As they sat there, Side by side, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, but they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt hopeful because he had Claire and she had him. And that was enough. The day Claire moved in was a day Jack would never forget. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was a start. Claire stepped hesitantly into Jack's house, her small bag of belongings clutched tightly in her hand. Jack smiled warmly, trying to make her feel at ease. "Welcome home, Claire," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. She looked around, her eyes wide, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. It would take time for her to feel like this was her home, but Jack was determined to help her every step of the way. The first few weeks were filled with ups and downs. Claire was used to taking care of herself, and Jack quickly realized that she struggled to accept help. She would try to do everything on her own, cooking, cleaning, even trying to fix things around the house. Jack had to gently remind her that she didn't have to do everything by herself anymore, that she had him now. There were moments when Claire would withdraw, shutting herself off from him, and Jack would give her space, waiting patiently until she was ready to open up again. One evening, Jack found Claire sitting on the porch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes distant. He walked over and sat down beside her, not saying anything at first. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Finally, Jack spoke. "You know, you don't have to be afraid here," he said gently. "This is your home now, and I want you to feel safe." Claire glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just hard. I've been on my own for so long." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I get that," he said softly, "and I know it's going to take time, but I'm not going anywhere, Claire. We're in this together." He reached out, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. Claire looked at him, her eyes softening, and for the first time in days, she gave him a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jack. It was a sign that she was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. Slowly but surely, they began to settle into a routine. Jack made sure that their mornings started with breakfast together, pancakes on Saturdays, eggs and toast on weekdays. It was a small ritual, but it brought a sense of normalcy that Claire desperately needed. She would sit at the kitchen table, watching as Jack flipped pancakes in the skillet, her expression gradually shifting from wary to content. They would talk about their plans for the day, sharing stories and laughter over their meal. Jack also introduced Claire to new experiences, things that she had never had the chance to do before. One weekend, he took her to the park and taught her how to ride a bike. Claire was hesitant at first, nervous about falling, but Jack was patient, holding onto the bike as she wobbled down the path. Her laughter echoed through the air when she finally managed to ride on her own, her face lighting up with pure joy. Jack couldn't help but smile, his heart swelling with pride. It was moments like these that made all the challenges worth it. There were also the quiet moments, the ones that weren't planned but meant the most. Like when they would sit on the couch together, watching movies late into the night. Claire slowly inching closer until she was leaning against Jack's side, her head resting on his shoulder. Jack would wrap an arm around her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living, and they were doing it together. But it wasn't all easy. There were setbacks, moments when the past crept in and threatened to pull them back. Claire still had nightmares sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night, her small frame trembling. Jack would rush to her room, sitting beside her and holding her hand until the fear subsided. He would whisper to her, telling her that she was safe, that he was there, and that she didn't have to face her fears alone. It broke his heart to see her like that, but it also strengthened his resolve. He was going to do everything in his power to make sure Claire knew she was loved and protected. One evening, as they were sitting at the dinner table, Claire looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "For what?" he asked. Claire hesitated, then shrugged. For everything. For giving me a home. For not giving up on me. Jack felt his throat tighten, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. You don't have to thank me, Claire. You're my family now, and I love you. I'm always going to be here for you. Claire smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. In that moment, Jack knew that they were going to be okay. They had faced challenges, and there would be more to come, but they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they were healing, building a life filled with love, laughter, and hope for the future. Jack looked at Claire, his heart full. He had lost so much in his life, but now he had found something even more precious, a family. And for that, he was endlessly grateful. The laundromat hadn't changed much since that first night Jack saw Claire there. Its bright fluorescent lights still flickered slightly, and the soft hum of the washing machines filled the air. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. Jack and Claire stood outside, side by side, looking at the place where their paths had first crossed. Jack smiled, his heart swelling with emotion as he glanced down at Claire. Ready to go in? He asked gently. Claire nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of nostalgia and contentment. They walked inside together, the bell above the door chiming softly. Jack noticed Claire's eyes drifting over to the bench where she had once sat alone, waiting for the laundry to finish, her small frame hunched and burdened by the weight of the world. But today, there was no sadness in her gaze. Instead, she looked at Jack and smiled, and Jack felt a warmth that reached deep into his soul. This place was no longer just a reminder of Claire's loneliness. It had become a symbol of everything they had overcome together. Jack watched as Claire moved to the laundromat, her hand brushing against the machines. He could see how much she had changed, how much they both had. The fear and uncertainty that had once filled her eyes were now replaced with hope and a quiet confidence. She was no longer that fragile girl trying to make it on her own. She was strong, brave, and more importantly, she was no longer alone. Jack felt a surge of pride as he watched her, his heart swelling with love for the young girl who had become his daughter. Do you remember the first time I saw you here? Jack asked, his voice soft. Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Yeah, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I remember. I was so scared. I didn't know what would happen if anyone found out I was alone. She looked up at Jack, her eyes meeting his. But then you showed up, and everything changed. Jack smiled, his throat tightening with emotion. You changed everything for me too, Claire, he said. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to care for someone again after losing my family. But then I met you, and you showed me that it was possible. He reached out, taking her hand in his. We've come a long way, haven't we? Claire squeezed his hand, her smile widening. Yeah, we have, she said. And I'm really glad we did. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the washing machines fading into the background as they looked at each other. In that instant, Jack knew that all the struggles, all the challenges they had faced had been worth it. They had found each other, and that was more than he could have ever hoped for. Jack glanced at the washing machines, then at Claire, an idea forming in his mind. What do you say we do a load of laundry? Just for old time's sake, he asked, a playful smile tugging at his lips. Claire laughed, a light, carefree sound that made Jack's heart swell. Seriously? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Jack nodded, his smile widening. Why not? Besides, I think we could both use some clean clothes for the week. Claire shook her head, still smiling as she reached for one of the empty laundry baskets. Together, they filled it with clothes, moving around the laundromat with an ease that spoke of the bond they had built over the months. As they worked, they talked about their plans for the future, about school, about the little things that made them laugh. It was simple, ordinary, but it was everything Jack had ever wanted. When the washing machine finally started its cycle, Jack and Claire sat down on the same bench where Claire had once sat alone. This time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, just the warmth of being together, the knowledge that they had found something special in each other. Jack put his arm around Claire's shoulders, pulling her close. She rested her head against him, her eyes closing as she let out a contented sigh. "Thank you, Jack," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Jack looked down at her, his heart overflowing with love. "For what?" he asked. Claire opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "For being my family," she said simply. Jack felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, and he blinked them away, his chest tightening with emotion. "You're my family too, Claire," he said, his voice thick. "And I love you more than anything." They sat there in silence for a while, the hum of the washing machines surrounding them like a comforting embrace. Jack knew that their journey was far from over, that there would still be challenges ahead, moments that tested them. But he also knew that they would face those challenges together as a family, and that was enough. As they left the laundromat that day, Jack looked down at Claire, his heart full. They had turned old memories into new ones. Memories filled with love, hope, and the promise of a future they would build together. Jack knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would be okay, because they had each other. And that was everything. The story of Jack and Claire is a powerful reminder of the importance of family and love, no matter how unexpected the circumstances. Their journey shows us that even in the darkest times, there is hope. Family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who are there for you, who love you unconditionally and who help you grow. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more inspiring stories of love, hope, and resilience.